Fantastic.
All
Thank
right,
you so much.
Many apologies to everybody, and thank you very much for sticking around. The illustration of one of the things the UK needs to do is upgrade its broadband infrastructure so we can avoid travelling quite as much. I was saying that we've gone a long way to solve our electricity problem, but we had lots of other issues with the system. And we don't have a route to complete decarbonisation of any sector. The UK government massively states that we can only move to about 70% renewables in our system. We can't do much more at the moment. So the suggestion in the book is that we develop a strategy of a huge expansion of renewable capacity, 20 times expansion of renewables capacity, to give us enough electricity almost all the time, even after demand is augmented by EVs and by heat pumps, electric heat pumps for domestic heating. Most of the time, perhaps almost all the time, 95% or more, we'll have with that enough electricity for the need at the moment. We'll store the surplus in the form of hydrogen. When I wrote this book a year ago, this was a very eccentric idea indeed, but since then, most Northern European countries have moved to the view that public policy demands that they install a massive amount of hydrogen generation capacity to fill the needs for energy that cannot be provided by electricity. How do we use that hydrogen? Well, how do we make it in the first place? We use electrolyzers. These are relatively well-known pieces of kit, but they're developing very fast. And the scale of the electrolyzer industry worldwide is going up by factors of 10 every year or so. It is absolutely remarkable what is happening to this industry. And we've now got in the UK, in the case of ITM Power, a Sheffield-based manufacturer, a business that's worth £1.5 billion that last year it was worth about 50. Just an indication of the size of the opportunity that's available in the electrolysis. Surplus electricity makes hydrogen. You probably did this when you were at school. Electricity generates the hydrogen at one electrode and oxygen in the other if you pass it through water. That's all we need to do to get hydrogen. We can then use that hydrogen either to make electricity, again, through a fuel cell when we don't have enough electricity from the renewables. We can use it to replace natural gas for heating systems, and hydrogen can perform the task of providing the key ingredient for synthetic fuels. This is to say, very low carbon alternatives to fossil fuels. There are certain sectors which we will not be able to fully decarbonize using electricity, of which aviation is probably the most obvious example. In those cases, we can make synthetic fuels which are a substitute for fossil fuels with zero carbon involved in the manufacture. And we'll talk about that bit later in the presentation. This is what an electrolyzer looks like at the megawatt scale. That will generate a relatively small amount of hydrogen. This is sitting in a single megawatt, a single large shipping container. But these are being built in the thousands, where a year ago they were being built in the tens. So they can be standardized, they're modular, and we can build factories of electrolyzers on the gigawatt scale. Gigawatt, for example, the total electricity demand in the UK at the moment is probably about 30 gigawatts. So we can now build these in sufficient quantities at a falling price, in sufficient volumes to mean that they can electrolyze all the surplus electricity that we get from our 20 times multiplication of renewable capacity. Where in the UK has gone furthest down the eccentric route that I'm suggesting we ought to go? Well, it's the little islands that sit on the top of Scotland, the Orkneys. Orkney has got tremendous wave and tidal resources, lots of wind as well onshore. But at the moment, it's wasting about 50% of the electricity it generates from wind because it doesn't have a good connection back to the Scottish mainland. The Orkney Islanders themselves decided they wanted to do something about this. They wanted their electricity to maintain some value to their electricity generation rather than having to turn it off when they had too much. And they came upon hydrogen. They said, look, this is the way in which we deal with surpluses and deficits of electricity. They've now got, for example, a primary school that's heated by hydrogen. They've got fuel cell vehicles using hydrogen across the islands and buses. They now generate electricity from hydrogen that's shipped from surplus islands to the mainland. That's an island. It's actually part of Auckland. It's not on the mainland of Scotland, down at the bottom. It's where all the port functions are now administered and are powered by hydrogen, with hydrogen storage and a fuel cell. So this is the experiment. This is the pilot for many places around the world. And it shows what we can do by putting a lot of renewables capacity in place and complementing it with hydrogen, so that when there's too much, we generate hydrogen. When there isn't enough electricity, we use hydrogen to make electricity and provide for our other needs. On a much larger scale, we're beginning to see examples around Europe and also in places like Australia of very large scale uses of hydrogen. What's happening on Auckland is at the megawatt scale. What's happening, what this proposal is to take things much closer to the gigawatt scale. That's 1,000 times as large. This is a plan which is now being worked out, is likely to happen. Ørsted, on the left-hand side, builds and operates many of the large offshore wind farms in the UK. It's developing a wind farm at a place called Hornsea 2, not far from Dogger Bank. With the surplus electricity from there, it's going to build electrolyzers using ITM power, the Sheffield company I mentioned. And that will generate electricity, it will generate hydrogen to be fed in to an oil refinery operated by Phillips on the Humber. Now there, the hydrogen will be used in very large quantities, but used to upgrade fossil fuels. So this is part of the fossil fuel economy, but it's an illustration of what can happen. This is happening also in many parts of Europe, particularly in Holland and Germany. We're beginning to see the central role of hydrogen and how cheap hydrogen can become if we continue to push down the cost of the electricity that's used to make that hydrogen. A bit more about expanding renewables, if I may. There's some skepticism about whether we can build 20 times as much offshore capacity at the moment. We've got about 10 gigawatts around the shores of Britain at the moment. We're talking about, therefore, needing something like 200 gigawatts in the North Sea and in other parts of the UK terrestrial waters. UK terrestrial waters, approximately half of the North Sea. Much of that is suitable for offshore wind. There are some marine conservation issues. That's going to rule out quite a lot of areas, but there's a lot of capacity here. Shell itself thinks that there's 900 gigawatts available in the North Sea compared to the 200 gigawatts, which I've suggested we might use. And the way to exploit that, almost certainly, in my opinion, is to do this, is to build man-made islands in the middle of the North Sea, collecting electricity from these massive wind farms and piping the electricity to the shore. That also enables very high quality, large-scale connections between the 5 or 6 countries that surround the North Sea, giving Northern Europe a chance to balance electricity demand from hour to hour. So this is all on a massive scale. These are billions of pounds each one of these islands would take to construct. But in the context of the requirement to completely decarbonize electricity, this looks to me like a sensible and inexpensive solution. And there's nobody who contends it's not physically possible. There's nobody who contends it won't make sense financially. We just have to develop the political will around Europe to make it happen. It would have been very much better if we'd remained in the European Union to do this. But nevertheless, even after exiting, it's perfectly possible to run these interconnectors in this way. I'm sorry to dash around a bit here, but what I'm suggesting in the book also is that we need to re-municipalize energy. That is to say, we need to take back control of energy supply and energy distribution from the private equity-backed companies that currently manage our electricity networks. With the exception of the national grid, I'm talking about the companies that bring electricity to your door. And in the book, I model what I think needs to happen and what happens today in Germany, where there are hundreds of locally owned municipal utilities. The biggest single one is the one in Munich, which provides gas, electricity, water, public baths, mobile phones, broadband, etc. A wide range of utilities. This is a profitable company. It's up to date. It makes money and it employs large numbers of local people. It's taken control and it can run things so that the electricity system, the energy system more generally, is run in the interests of the local people. That's important just A, for social equity reasons, but B, because it enables the utilities to develop on the basis of for example, buying and selling electricity locally, so that if you have surplus electricity from your roof, you can sell it to the school down the road. That's now technically possible with advances in digitalization, but it's being fought very fiercely against by the large companies who manage the electricity distribution networks in the UK, whose main interest is in making sure that as large amounts of electricity as possible are shipped long distances. I'm putting it slightly too harshly there, but there is a real significant problem here, and I believe, I try to justify my case in the book, that we need to put everything back into municipal control to make decarbonisation happen fastest and at the lowest possible cost. By the way, this municipal utility in Munich isn't fully renewable yet, but it's investigating buying electricity from Norway to complement its hydropower from the Alps to make it 100% renewable. I talk in the book about the next area, which is the decarbonisation of domestic heat. A very important area in the UK. About 25% of total emissions come from the operation of heating of buildings, of which the most important is the heating of domestic homes. We have the worst housing stock in the world, in the developed world, excuse me, from a point of view of insulation, biggest heating losses, and therefore very high bills compared to many other places. We can solve part of that problem by improving insulation, and there's a lot in the book about that. But we also probably need to continue to operate central heating boilers, and people will need these. And we can build these boilers using to use hydrogen. This is a Worcester Bosch boiler. Worcester Bosch is the largest supplier of central heating boilers into the UK, subsidiary of the German company Bosch. And this boiler can be switched from natural gas to hydrogen. It costs roughly the same as a natural gas boiler. Natural gas would be cheaper at the moment, but as we push the cost of hydrogen down, those differences will tend to disappear. So this is possible. The decarbonisation of domestic heat is possible. We can do so partly by improving insulation, reducing the amount of heat loss, also switching some housing to electric heating through heat pumps, but we also will need, in many houses, domestic boilers like this. Should I stop there for a second, Ben, and we can have a chat?
Yes. So if we probably what we'll do, Chris. Okay, yeah, we'll break out again into rooms. Just a quick couple of minute break. We were planning to have a couple of breaks for everyone to sit and talk and chat and talk about interesting points in the presentation. So we'll do that. Obviously, you can use it to use the facilities and so on and so forth. And then Chris will probably just in the interest of time, then we'll make this the one break, and then we'll plow through and then get to the questions at the end, if that's okay. So if we do a 5-minute breakout room now, if you bear with me. I'm just taking the host back. So we're going to open up all the rooms again, and you'll get a minute warning, but obviously do use it to use the facilities if you need, and do please come back. We still have quite a lot of people in the room, so we're hoping to have some interesting discussion at the end. Obviously we'll be going on a little bit longer, so we'll see you all in 5 minutes. Yeah. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for coming back. There's quite a lot of people who are still here listening to us.
Yeah. Sorry about this. I'm really sorry. It's very unprofessional. But
it's technology. Technology is wonderful until it doesn't work.
Until it doesn't work. Yeah.
I'm going to put myself on mute just whilst, because my fiance, who is very supportive right now, is in the other room in one of the breakout rooms. So thank you very much, everyone. Back in a few minutes.
Hi. I don't know who I'm in a group with. I can't hear anybody else.
Vivian, you're not yet in a group. I'm going to assign you to one.
Oh, right. I'm not in a group. Oh, that's why I can't.
I'm not in a group either.
Fine. Okay. I don't quite know what's happened there. So I'm going to assign you all out to groups and you can go and join people. Chris, I'm not going to sign you out. You can stay there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Unless you particularly want to.
So do I?
You should have an invite now that you can accept. Right. So Chris, if it
Did you say something, Ben?
no, that's probably my fiance chatting in the other room.
Okay.
So Chris, is that okay? Just in terms of the interest of time, because we've had obviously technical issues. If it's okay for you just to do the rest of the presentation, and then we'll sort of go back to questions afterwards.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, look. I'm less than halfway through, but we're after 8 o'clock. I don't want to hold people up.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I think it's okay to. It's fascinating, so I think people would just be interested to get on with it, and then we can have the questions at the end. Obviously, we'll just, if you're okay to go through, maybe we'll just give another half an hour until 9.
Yep. Okay. If that's okay. That's what.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. Sorry again, my fiance in the back there.
That's it. Yeah.
Right, Chris, I'm calling them all back. They'll be back in about 50 seconds.
Okay, yeah.
A minute warning, and then if it's okay, I think we just want to hear, we want to hear the presentation. There's lots of fascinating stuff here, so if you're okay to carry on through, and then we'll
Yes,
just
sure,
go to the questions.
Sure.
I can hear my fiance in the background. She's interested to hear about the food section.
Okay. Never popular, that.
Right, okay. Bear in mind you are talking to a lot of Extinction Rebellion people, so.
Yes. Okay. All right. So the audience is not. It's not as it were, representative. No. Okay.
I even gave up meat.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm a vegetarian now, and I do miss meat terribly. But I'd be interested to hear what he says on food as well.
Fantastic. Right. Thank you. So we should have everyone back in the room now. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to close that. So in the interest of time, we've asked, and I think we're all very interested in the presentation. So I've asked Chris just to, we were going to have another breakout in another 10 minutes, but let's, we're going to ask Chris to go through and then we'll move on to the questions, if that's okay. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, thank you again, everybody, for coming back. I'm trying to make the case here that hydrogen is the central feature of the non-electricity economy, and the fact is that we can do almost everything with hydrogen that we need from the point of view of energy. It's not going to be easy in some circumstances, but here's an illustration of the way the world's moving. This is the Yara, it's the world's biggest fertilizer producer, I think, plant in Pilbara, Western Australia. Pilbara is a truly exceptional area. It has fantastic wind resources and also sun at the same time. Possibly the best place in the world to make hydrogen because there's so much electricity potential from renewables. Of the current uses of hydrogen, fertilizer is the second most important. And so the decarbonisation of fertilizer production depends upon switching from hydrogen generated from fossil fuels, which is the way it's done at the moment, to the use of hydrogen generated from renewables. And this is the first large-scale plant that's going to be attempted. We're talking about 2–3% of global emissions here. We've also got a slightly larger sector, the steel market, to worry about. Steel, probably 4–5% worldwide for emissions. It largely comes from the burning of coal to reduce the iron ore, to heat it up and then tear the oxygen off the iron ore and leave just the metal. And the Swedish steel producer SSAB is in the lead here. This is a plant that's going to use hydrogen instead of coal to make iron from iron ore. This is, as you can see, being built at the moment in northern Sweden. Almost every large manufacturer of steel around the world recognizes that it will not be able to continue to use coal. Hydrogen currently is more expensive. The intention is, however, to build enough hydrogen capacity so that the cost comes down to roughly coal. But we probably also need a tax on coal to make hydrogen for steel making as inexpensive as coal is at the moment. And that's something I'll discuss very briefly at the end. Now, so the last big sector that we need to talk about where hydrogen should be used to replace fossil fuels is in the manufacture, as I mentioned earlier, of substitutes for oil-based products. Petrol, aviation kerosene, for example, and plastics. And for that, we need hydrogen and CO2, or a source of carbon, more explicitly, which CO2 is a good example. And we pass those products through what is called a Fischer-Tropsch process. These are chemical engineering processes which have been around for 100 years or so. There is nothing particularly technically advanced about doing that. So if you've got carbon dioxide, more particularly carbon monoxide, and hydrogen, you can use Fischer-Tropsch to make all the things on the right-hand side through intermediate steps, but nevertheless it's possible. How do we get the CO2? Well, yesterday the Swiss firm Climeworks announced that it had just raised $75 million to push expansion of probably the world's most advanced techniques for directly capturing carbon dioxide from the air. This plant sitting on a roof not far from Zurich with those 18 fans on the top is passing a lot of air over a chemical. That chemical is catching the CO2 and holding it. Then the plant takes that chemical and heats it separately, and the CO2 is driven off. The CO2 is stored in that big tank to the right-hand side, and then it's fed to those enormous greenhouses in the back of the picture, where it's used to enhance the growth of plants. So this is one of Climeworks' first plants, but it's available in lots of different places around the world, and we'll see a couple of illustrations later. Climeworks is a company you've probably never heard of, but is one of the most important parts of the 100% decarbonised economy, in my view. This is a very much smaller Climeworks installation. This is at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, which makes diesel from electrolysis of hydrogen, from the capture of carbon dioxide from the air, and their combination in a Fischer-Tropsch process on the little thing on the left-hand side of this container, which says Innertech on it. That is a micro Fischer-Tropsch plant, and out of this comes diesel. Of course, it's quite expensive at the moment. The technology's got a long way to go, but this, I believe, is the model for the way the world should move towards full decarbonisation of those fuels which we find difficult to switch to electricity or other sources of energy. We're left with the most difficult problem possibly of all, which is the manufacture of cement. And here we're seeing lots of different attempts, but the problem is that when you make cement, it's inherently productive of CO2. You're heating a carbonate and turning it into an oxide, having driven off carbon dioxide. But there are many techniques now available for making sure that the net CO2 emissions from cement production can fall to zero. So this is the one bit which hydrogen probably won't solve. It might help in some respects, but it's not central to the decarbonisation. But nevertheless, there are alternatives to this. But the impression I want you to take from this, if I may, is that electricity made from renewables plus hydrogen can combine together to make an energy system, not just electricity, an energy system, which is completely decarbonised at reasonable cost. It would be more expensive today to make these switches, but it's coming down in price very quickly. Let's move on to food, if I may. And the most important feature of the food system from the point of view of climate change is the keeping of livestock. About 25% of global emissions come from the agriculture sector. Numbers vary. Not everybody agrees with this figure. Some say 20, some say more than 25%. But there's absolutely no doubting the fundamental truth that livestock, particularly cattle and sheep, have a dramatically large impact on global emissions. Probably about 15%, 1/6, 1/7 of total emissions come from livestock, of which 10% come from cattle. So full decarbonisation requires us to completely change the food system, to move away from meat, essentially. Yes, we can have small quantities of meat, we can have free-range meat wandering in forests, but this would be enormously expensive compared to the agricultural systems we have at the moment. And it's actually probably far better to move towards a vegan diet, possibly based upon partly on meat substitutes, artificial meat substitutes. In my view, probably the world isn't going to move towards that. It's going to move towards plants, pure plants, because meat substitutes are inherently highly processed, at least they seem to be at the moment. And I think that has clearly significant effects on human health and also has possibly other environmental implications. So a move away, I propose a dramatic move away from meats towards pulses, grains, and fresh fruit and vegetables, and nuts and seeds and things like that in the human diet. And that's recommended by dietitians quite as strongly as people who work on climate change. Now, when it comes to grains, I think there's a very interesting question here. Industrial monocultures of grain, such as we see in fields in the southern part of England, where one grain variety is grown, it's subject to pests, it has to be fertilized, it has to have vast amounts of chemicals added. It's not clear to me that that's also sustainable. It has quite high climate change implications, and it's doing terrible things to our soils, and in general resulting in carbon emissions from the soils themselves, which is adding to the problems of the world's carbon budget. Now, there's one potential way forward, and that is to move back to the cultivation of the Middle Ages. It sounds absolutely absurd. We've grown up with the view that agriculture depends upon us continuing to industrialize, continuing to breed plants. But this individual farmer, John Letts, who farms in small holdings across Oxfordshire, it's showing that it's possible to get yields from very old heritage varieties of grains, which might grow 2 meters tall, that are comparable over a decade with yields that are generated from industrial agriculture in East Anglia, growing single varieties of wheat. So what he's cutting in the field on the left-hand side is a mixture of hundreds of different subtypes of heritage grains. Why is this important? Well, number one, this is much less susceptible to pest problems. If you've got 100 different varieties, the pest might go for one, but 99 remain untouched. So he has very much less significant need for any form of chemical intervention. In fact, he's fully organic. Second point is these grains, as you may have seen from photographs or paintings of people cutting wheat hundreds of years ago, they grow to 2 meters tall. They strangle all forms of weed. You don't need herbicides in the same way. So you can see there are weeds in that, but they nevertheless have not stopped the grain producing a good yield. On the right-hand side is a further illustration of the advantages of this form of grain cultivation. The roots are much deeper of these plants than current grains we grow in conventional agriculture. That means that even in the dry years, the dry summers that we increasingly are going to have to expect, these plants will be viable where in current modern varieties would not be. There's a lot more to discuss. I thought that there's an extraordinarily interesting interview to do with John Letts, and I hope that his views will begin to be taken seriously in the agricultural community, because it seems to me he makes a good case for the long-term viability of this technology, of his heritage grains. We need to also to change, of course, a lot of habits. I'm dashing through the book, of course, now. Clothing, also a reasonably significant proportion of our global emissions and more generally our environmental problems come from the clothing manufacturer, and the fact that virtually no clothes in the UK or elsewhere are fully recycled or recyclable. Yes, you can remake some clothing, but almost all but about 2% of clothing in the UK ends up in landfill or being exported for use elsewhere. Now, what's the alternative here? One is probably to buy a lot fewer clothes, to remake them, to refashion them instead of disposing of them after a few wears. We buy approximately a third more clothing than we do 20 years ago as individuals, for example, and we, on average, only wear a piece of clothing 100 times before we throw it away. We need to move away from that, but we also need to completely change the fabrics that we use. We need to move away probably towards cellulose-based fabrics, of which this is one, Tencel, and away from cotton, which causes environmental problems pretty much everywhere where it's grown and is an extraordinarily important user of scarce water resources, or polyester, with all the problems that is likely to have. Polyester is also essentially unrecyclable at the moment. Cellulose can't be directly recycled, but can be broken down and then remade. So it's much closer to being circular than cotton or polyester are likely to be for some time. Talked a bit about cars. Obviously, to some extent, the argument is we shouldn't be using cars at all. We need to move away from private transport absolutely where we can. The point I try to make in my book is that electric cars are now, broadly speaking, cost competitive with in internal combustion engine cars. But more importantly, on the right-hand side, we're beginning to see that we can also use electricity for powering very heavy vehicles, right up to full 40-ton vehicles. Nobody thought this was possible 2 years ago, but it's increasingly looking as though we are going to be able to electrify almost every part of our transport system other than aviation. We're going to certainly be able to electrify or use hydrogen for trains, buses, garbage collection vehicles, and so on and so forth. And right-hand side is a Mercedes-Benz electric vehicle. I think that's probably a 10-ton truck. It's now economic, almost certainly, to use electric buses. It makes financial sense to use that, and also urban delivery vehicles are electrifying rapidly around the world. But we need to move. We need to be active in the way we transport ourselves. On the right-hand side is an illustration of the way that some Dutch cities go. This is part of the Utrecht bicycle infrastructure. There are bicycle spaces for about 35,000 bikes close to the railway station in Utrecht. That's a town of 300,000 people. Over 50% of journeys inside Utrecht are now walking or cycling. So you can move a very long way to drive cycling into the pole position, even in large cities like London, I suspect. On the right-hand side is one of the pioneers in car-free city centres, Pontevedra. Key lesson I'd want to draw from this is that every single city that I've ever come across which has made a move towards reducing access to cars into the city has stuck with it and has benefited from it. It's good for local employment, it's good for local commerce, and everybody is healthier and feels more part of the city than they would otherwise be. And I think to the extent we've seen that around large cities in the UK over the last 3 months, that point is being made more and more strongly. We can use electricity for short distance ferries. This is an example of a boat that plies between islands in Denmark on the left-hand side. And electric ferries can be probably made to cover quite long distances, 50 kilometers or so, to carry freight and people. For long distance shipping, we're almost certainly going to move to hydrogen as the basis for the power system through fuel cells, but also probably to use ammonia in some circumstances, which is a derivative of hydrogen. The problem we've got is aviation, and there we're going to need, on the right-hand side, if we're going to continue to operate some flights, obviously we firstly should look at reducing the amount of flying that we do, but we're going to need some flying to occur, and that can be done with synthetic fuels made from the hydrogen that I've suggested we should be making from electrolysis in periods of surplus electricity supply. Right, if we move to hydrogen, we face the problem that unless we radically improve insulation standards in the UK, we are probably going to load extra costs onto people, many of whom would not find it easy to meet those costs. The most important, for most things, people who have high incomes spend a great deal more on things than people who don't have very much income. The exception for that is heating, where people on lower incomes spend almost as much as people in the top quarter of the income distribution, partly because the houses often aren't very well insulated. This is a row of houses in Nottingham that was refurbished using a radical technique imported from the Netherlands called energy sprong. Two of the houses here were in private ownership. Those you can see, so you can see what the house looked like before they were converted. The rest of them were converted, and they've moved to where they've got solar panels on the roof. There's a ground source heat pump providing heating into them, and they're virtually zero carbon. This housing conversion was not cheap, but it's produced houses of infinitely better quality than were there before. The average heating bills were about £1,500 for these houses, massive amount of money for the people who lived in them to pay. That's been reduced by about 80%, I believe, the latest figures have shown. There's an example of the kind of deep refurbishment that we really need to invest in as we come out of this dreadful depression at the moment. So far, we haven't been very good at improving insulation in British housing. We need to be much more radical and involved in deep refurbishment, that is to say, looking at the house as a unit rather than simply putting a bit of insulation into cavity walls, for example. I'm going to race on a bit here because I realise that time is passing. In the book, I have a chapter on the importance of increasing the amount of forest cover that the UK has. The green areas here are areas of high forest share in the countries of Europe and Turkey. You can see that most of Britain, there's some exceptions in Western Scotland, but very large portions of Britain have very low cover of woodland compared to almost all the rest of Europe. Holland's also pretty deforested, but only about 13% of Britain is covered by forest compared to an average of about 33% in Spain, France, Germany, and Italy, the largest other European states by land area. So my proposal in the book is to capture carbon by adding significantly to the amount of forested land in the UK, probably approximately tripling it. Well, is that possible, you say? Well, yes, it is. Something like a half of Britain's land area is currently given over to low-grade grazing in one form or another, principally of sheep, but also to some extent of other animals. Now, in my vision of the future, we really shouldn't be giving over so much of our land area to this. Sheep, in general, are producers of greenhouse gas emissions, not reducers. Forestry will reduce it. So it makes very good sense to switch from the use of land for low-grade agriculture to forestry. And it helps produce a great deal of employment. It should produce a great deal of employment, such as it does in other parts of Europe, and reduce the bills that we have to pay for forest imports. Very approximately, we make 0.3 million tonnes of sheep meat on that land area, that massive fraction of the UK's land area. We could make about 40 million tonnes of CO2 saving by each year by handing that land over to forestry instead, on the same amount of land that's given currently to sheep. Benefit, well, sheep production is an extremely expensive thing to do. Obviously, it provides a livelihood. It's a very important thing culturally across parts of the UK. Shouldn't dismiss this, but it costs about £1 billion. The UK is also the second largest importer of forest products in the world after China, with costing £8 billion. So my suggestion in the book is we need to move to using less than productive agricultural land for wood creation and the replacement of imports, instead of trying to grow sheep rather unsuccessfully on that land. I argue in the book, I'm just going to dash through this stuff in there because I want to go into one last slide where I talk about the social advantages of decarbonisation. I argue in the book for a carbon tax that makes it possible to push for renewables plus hydrogen as the basis of our electricity system and switch rapidly away from fossil fuels as the basis of our energy economy. I realise this is a bit recherché and perhaps people are sceptical about whether carbon taxes are the right thing to do because they appear to add to the costs of buying things with carbon. But I try to show in the book that in the places where it's been tried, such as in Sweden, it's helped drive out fossil fuel use in entire sectors, and provided it's accompanied by appropriate subsidies and incentives, it can reduce total bills. There's also a section of the book on the need for carbon capture and storage. Not just carbon capture for making fuels, for synthetic fuels, but also permanent storage. So this is a photograph of a geothermal power plant in Iceland, which also uses Climeworks technology to capture CO2 from the air and then store that CO2 deep in basalt rocks, which absorb the CO2 and are chemically changed forever. So that CO2 is there into infinity. This is one of the most exciting technologies in the world. There's a lot of basalt around which will happily absorb CO2. There's also rock like olivine, which we should be looking at in great detail as a way of capturing CO2 directly from the air using existing chemical processes through the weathering of rocks. Right, I'm just dashing through here. Last slide, if I may. In the book, I try to make the argument that proper decarbonisation, done in roughly the way I'm suggesting in the outline plan I'm provided, will be good for social equity. It means better insulated homes, which is of particular advantage to the less well-off, better public transport, ditto. It means we reduce pollution, including noise, and many of us have seen the benefits of that over the last few months and are sad as it gradually disappears. We're going to get better food, good quality jobs in renewables and forestry and wood products, particularly in the areas of the UK's periphery, the least economically advantaged places oftenly. It should also enable us, through the development of a full circular economy, to provide inexpensive, high-quality second-hand clothes and other goods, such as electronics, which we recycle constantly. And we provide, in my argument, much better local control over energy so that people get both lower bills and feel that their utility is providing services properly for them. And lastly, sharing a dividend from the carbon tax. Yes, we need to raise money from a carbon tax to drive carbon products out of our system, but at the same time, we need to give the money from that back to individuals so that it disproportionately benefits the less well-off. So there's the argument in the book in a nutshell. We need to do this both for climate change reasons and also to produce a better, healthier society.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. That was brilliant and very much worth the wait. I have now opened up the chat. If people would like to post up any questions, obviously Chris' book there, and actually the carboncommentary.com is worth saying. That's worth joining as well, Chris, as a bit of a plug for your newsletter. I find that very interesting. So Matt, thank you very much. Is it fair to say, sorry, I've lost that. Is it fair to say bamboo forests in the UK will soak up more carbon than tree forests? Bamboo grows faster and collects more carbon, allegedly, than trees. Good question.
I've not heard that argued about the UK before. Where does that come from? Obviously, it would be true in some tropical and subtropical places, but I would have thought the conditions weren't ideal in the UK for growing bamboo in comparison to, say, growing native trees. Am I not well informed enough on that?
Okay, thank you. I know I had it in a garden next door to me, a few houses back.
Oh, look, bamboo will grow. But look, there is certain, the people who make bamboo don't tell us often just how difficult it is to process bamboo into the things which we buy made of bamboo, such as a pair of socks, which I got. It's chemically intense, it's energy intense. It's probably better to grow, if we want, for clothing, bamboo is probably less good than cellulose, in my opinion. And we can get, I think, per unit area, a lot more carbon stored from fast-growing crops like miscanthus than we would do from bamboo. But I'm possibly out of date on that. There may be data which your questioner is asking, knows about, which I'm not aware of.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Chris. So lots of questions coming through, which is great. Anna, will the synthetic fuel and plastic from electrolytes be cleaner and the plastic easier to degrade?
We have a choice. We can make plastics that are easier to degrade, but they are less durable. In my model, for what it's worth, and this is something that we could sit here around a table arguing for days, I want relatively small amounts of plastic constantly reused, hard plastics to replace metals and other things which would have actually a higher carbon footprint. I want us to use less plastics and not rely upon biological degradation or any other sort. Single-use plastics need to be pushed out of the system, whether they're made from synthetic fuels, so low-carbon synthetic fuels, or whether they're made from oil. And I worry that we're possibly not quite got round to recognizing that. Sorry, this is, I'm talking here, this is very much a personal view. I realize that opinions on plastics can be very strongly held with good logic. But my view is that we should be just simply trying to reduce the amount of plastic and making hard plastics, not soft ones, which last forever.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. So Jeffrey says, what are the costs of reducing consumption so that actually the proposals become relatively less costly because there's less consumption to deal with?
Well, let's take an illustration of that. The conversion of a low quality 1930s house built badly to something that is close to zero carbon. We are talking there of tens of thousands, probably latest illustrations from Holland, probably around 40,000 for the typical semi. So that's very, very expensive. But on the other hand, the health benefits from that are enormous, improving them. And second, we are at the moment in world history when money has no cost. States can borrow money at negative interest rates. So although it sounds very illogical, counterintuitive, now is a good time, a very good time to be spending on expensive things which deliver their return over generations, over decades, over centuries. And that wasn't a very good answer to that question. Apologies, I got lost slightly.
No, but it was a very good point, Chris. And actually, I think the key focus is making sure that the money doesn't get spent on the wrong things, which I'm sure we're all aware of.
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll see an illustration on this. Countries around the world are saying, right, our New Deal, our Green New Deal, will avoid any form of subsidy to carbon-using activities. So, or they're minimizing it. Now, we, as a political movement, have to push for the UK's policies to be harder and faster than anybody else's. No subsidy for fossil fuel cars. Minimal subsidy for aviation, but entirely based on its commitment to rapid decarbonisation. Aviation knows where to go. It knows what it has to do. But it's a sucker for government subsidies around the world, and it has insufficient leverage to get what it wants. Our task is to say no subsidy for aviation without a commitment to decarbonisation in a short period of time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. So carrying on, so excuse me, there's quite a lot here, which is great. Thank you very much, everyone. It's nice to see we still have 30 participants, so thank you for the hardcore for staying around. Where am I? So Gilbert says, on electrification, what is the sweet spot for how fast to shift away from legacy vehicles to electric? How fast do you think that shift should be?
Right. So I think the question, forgive me, I forgot the person's name, forgive me,
Gilbert,
is saying, well, look, we don't necessarily want, building a car is in itself intensely fossil fuel producing. We want people to keep their cars for longer and make the switch to electric personal transport only as fast as the existing stock falls into disuse. That's an argument. It's very difficult to model this. You can't simply say, well, we should do 2% a year. Or I don't think it's easy to do that. What we've seen in some countries is that you can grow the electric percentage of the vehicle fleet really quite fast. So we've got now 70% electric vehicles in Norway entering the market. But that doesn't push the old vehicles out very fast. Typical vehicles got a life of 13 or 14 years in the UK. We probably want to therefore replace, we want electric vehicles to replace that very quickly, but we probably don't want to drive out diesel or petrol vehicles, which are before they cease to be useful. cease to be operable, right? So once
So
again, a very rambling answer there to a very, very complicated question.
So the embodied carbon in existing cars, yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah.
So Victoria would like...
That's something that needs to be weighted very heavily in this. It's no good just arguing that everybody should have an electric car. We need to have fewer cars on the road, but we need also to make sure the electric cars that are made with minimal greenhouse gas emissions, which is not the case at the moment. Batteries do still take quite a lot of GHGs to make.
Yes. So Victoria would like to understand a little bit more about the benefits of putting the CO2 into rocks. Is it being put into existing rocks, or is it essentially condensed into new rocks?
Well, in the case of basalt, it's being piped into rock, and the basalt says, "Thank you very much. I like the carbon and oxygen. I'm going to turn myself into another rock using it." In the case of olivine, which is equally attractive, which is another type of rock, which has got an olive type color, which is olivine, is that the most interesting idea that's coming up at the moment is grinding this widely available rock, it's not scarce at all, into very, very small pieces, and then dumping it on beaches where it will be rapidly weathered by the waves, and in particular picks up the CO2 in those waves and naturally transmutes permanently into a different rock.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. So there's lots of questions coming here, Chris, if you're happy to keep going. Ruth, there's, what does the hydrogen do to the soil fertility in the long run?
The hydrogen.
Ruth, I'm not sure if we can get, there's no hydrogen going into the soil.
I thought you said that you were going to use hydrogen as fertilizer. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm terribly sorry.
Thank you, Ruth.
Conventional fertilizer. Forgive me for being slow. Conventional fertilizer is based on ammonia. Ammonia is a combination of nitrogen and hydrogen, NH3. Hydrogen. Hydrogen is combined in a process called the Haber-Bosch process with nitrogen to form the basis of ammonium fertilizers. We ideally don't want to use much fertilizer on our soils because in general, under most circumstances, what comes out of that is nitrous oxide when the fertilizer breaks down. And that's an important greenhouse gas. And it's one of the reasons why agriculture is a source of greenhouse gas, a big source of greenhouse gases. Not CO2 particularly, but nitrous oxide and methane. So ideally, we need to move away from chemical fertilizers. And that's going to be difficult to do. But trying to invent new techniques based around the kind of thing that John Letts, the bloke on this combine harvester, is doing, generating comparable yields to existing conventional agriculture, better than conventional organic, through the use of old varieties of wheat and grains. If we can avoid using fertilizer on fields, the better we're doing, because it is profoundly productive of greenhouse gases.
Brilliant, thank you.
So we can decarbonize its production, but we still don't deal with the problem that fertilizer on fields tends to produce nitrous oxide.
Thank you, Chris. I think one of the scenes that you mentioned that came to me in the book that really hammered it home is that when you look at a painting from medieval times, all the people are shorter than the crops, and it's definitely not the case nowadays. So it's just interesting how our food has evolved.
So what we did was breed through the Norman Borlaug years, the Green Revolution, was breed much shorter crops. Short crops also have very short roots, much shorter roots. So as the summers dry out in places like the UK, which we're already beginning to see, it's going to be more and more difficult to continue to grow those. And we'd be much better growing those medieval varieties of grain.
On that note, Ruth asked, is there any use for horses in transport, or is that still too much methane?
Oh, I don't know.
It's an interesting question.
Well, horses don't produce anywhere near as much methane as cows, but I'm not sure we could. Well, the problem with horse dung. I don't have a good answer to that.
I'm not sure on that one, I'm afraid.
It's appealing, but can I just? One of the problems those of us who are really worried about climate change face is that we may often be seen as people who wish to roll back the progress of the last 150 years. And that really puts a lot of people off, what you might term normal folk. And trying to produce radical solutions which are really going to get decarbonisation quickly without making people deeply worried that all the things which they hold dear about modern life are going to disappear is a very difficult challenge for all of us to face. Saying to people, well, look, we probably can't travel as much by air, you can't fly anymore, is not a thing that is going to win many politicians' votes. It's a lot easier to say that now than it was even a year ago or 2 years ago before Greta Thunberg. But nevertheless, we people who think this is the world's most difficult problem, the biggest challenge that civilization has ever faced, need to bring everybody else along with us. And this is not going to be easy if we're asking for radical changes in lifestyle.
Yes, I think, I've always thought that protests tend to be a lot about the no and not enough about the yes. And, this is why I like the work you do, Chris, in terms of the positives and the technologies that are coming through. Yes, no, apologies. I think we missed your question around COVID. Actually, talking about changes, how do you think COVID will impact the long-term use of public versus private transport? It's a challenging one.
There'll be people in the audience who know more about this than me. Well, everybody knows what's going on. We're seeing greater use of private cars where possible, and we're also seeing greater amounts of walking and cycling. Which of those is going to dominate in cities, I do not know. I know, based upon experience around Europe, that we can do a vastly better job at cycling provision and pedestrianisation in large cities, and I think there's likely to be big, strong political moves towards that, although, Ben, you were saying earlier that Southwark isn't doing very much. But other places will try it. And but will people move out of private cars for longer distance and go back to public transport? I just don't know. I think we're too early to tell on that.
Interesting question, though. Yes, Southwark did do, with Southwark Cyclists, did do a critical mass last weekend, about 100 cyclists on the road. And actually, that went down very successfully, by all accounts. And actually, there are quite a few cities that are using the opportunity of COVID to increase their cycling infrastructure and shut out cars from roads. Sure. So that's a good sign. I think Madrid is 75 miles of roads.
One thing that XR could do is develop databases, easy to use, easy to access databases of what's working around the UK. So if Bristol significantly improves cycling provision, it's likely to happen, does this work? So that we can all take to our own local authorities, look, proof, but by turning big old roads into cycling ways, you can do this, this and this. I mean, one of the statistics in the book is about the impact on public health in Utrecht of the growth of cycling over the last generations. And they've estimated the reduced costs that come from the fact that people cycle more, they're traveling more actively, and compared it to the costs of setting up cycleways. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I can tell you the public health benefits are vastly greater than the cost of cycling provision.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So Chris, Matthew says, what are the barriers to getting 20 times renewables capacity as required to reach zero emissions? What are the key barriers that you see right now?
Well, first of all, it's getting people to say, to move away from just immediate skepticism and say, look, let's have a look at this. Let's see whether it's possible. How much land would we have to give over if we multiplied our solar by 20 times? Well, it's probably about 6 or 7% of the UK's land area, for example. So it's not insignificant, but it's perfectly possible. And it involves taking land that would otherwise be used often for low quality grazing. There's no question that 200 gigawatts in the North Sea, which is roughly what I'm suggesting, is difficult. It's going to use a great deal of land, but it's perfectly possible. There's enough land, there's enough marine land with less than 50 meters of sea cover to make it perfectly viable to do that. Interestingly, when anybody talks about offshore wind now, they are beginning to step up the amount of capacity that they think is possible and the amount that's envisageable. I mean, there's now talk of 100 gigawatts in the North Sea. I'm just saying roughly 200. So it's not an order of magnitude different. Germany yesterday said, yeah, we are now going to plan for 40 gigawatts in our section of the North Sea, and we, the UK, have a vastly greater area in Germany. So look, it is possible. We just need to get over the feeling that it's all too dramatic, it's all too radical. It isn't. It's now the cheapest way of doing things.
Thank you very much. And actually what's very cool with wind as well is that they're starting to build wind turbines out of wood, which is additional carbon sequestration, which is just amazing. Yeah,
indeed. Well, I mean, in the book, I talk about the importance of using wood for building. Absolutely should be using. Almost all types of building can be better built by wood, including really quite large skyscrapers. There are 9, 10 story buildings now being built with wood in other parts of the world. New technologies make it perfectly possible. Indeed, much smaller, much less concrete in the foundations because these are much lighter buildings. As you say, they'll store forever and they're much easier to insulate.
Brilliant, fantastic. So, Eloise, is the challenge for electric planes just batteries?
I'm sure we'll get very short distance electric planes. We're already seeing them. Planes that can travel for 30 minutes with 10 people on board. Very, very, I think I put a number in the book for how much of the total fossil fuel consumption by planes can be transferred to batteries. And we're talking of the order of 3, 4, 5% at most, in all probability. Batteries are never going to be as energy dense, unless something absolutely extraordinary happens, which I don't think anybody envisages, never going to be as dense as kerosene, as an energy carrier. So yes, those islands in the Orkneys of Scotland, yeah, we're going to have electric planes popping between those two places. I don't think we're going to have flights across the Atlantic with electricity at any point.
Brilliant, thank you. So, Ruth, why do we need to continue to manufacture cement? Can we not just repair our old stock, use eco-building techniques and renewables and so on and so forth? Why do we
go a long way? Right, we can go a long way down that route, but we will always need some cement. I'm talking about the UK here, but in countries which are urbanizing, they will still need to use a considerable amount of cement. Now, if we switch to wood for construction, we don't have anything like as big a problem, but there are some things that cannot easily be done without cement, bridges, for example. And in those cases, we'll continue to use it. So we need to find a decarbonisation route. And the only reason for putting it in the presentation today is that it's pretty much the only thing which cannot be significantly decarbonised by electricity or hydrogen. I just wanted to mention it because it's problematic.
So Ellie says, many have warned of the emission costs associated with the transition, e.g. materials required to retrofit the housing stock to be energy efficient. Does the plan that you've created account for the carbon baked into the actual transition period?
Not as, look, the plan in here is not detailed. It requires a great deal of work to flesh out, and I wouldn't. And it's these are fantastic questions which are probing the the important uncertainties about this. Now, in the case of building refurbishment, we can do that with relatively low carbon costs, as far as I could see, from embedded carbon. We cannot continue to make vast numbers of private cars and meet our carbon objectives. So we do need to radically move away from the individually owned private car, partly through sharing, partly through public transport, partly through walking and cycling, etc. But the question is absolutely fundamental. We can't. It's no good just talking about consumption. It's also the process of production that we need to make sure is as decarbonised as possible. We can decarbonise steel. We can decarbonise many of the other things which are the foundations of the embedded carbon in our economy. But nevertheless, it's something that will continue to be an issue for generations to come. But there's lots of ways in which progress is occurring in that. The big manufacturers, whether they be aluminium manufacturers, as I said, every single large steel manufacturer in the world is trying to come up with ways of using hydrogen to replace coal. A lot of the embedded emissions and the things that worry us most, our computers, our phones, our clothes, can actually themselves be decarbonised.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. Just to let you know, everyone, we've got a few more questions, so another 5 minutes or so, if that's okay. But it's fantastic. Everyone's got so much questions coming through. It's a big one from Ruth. I don't know if we've got time to answer this, but are you envisioning a future? So she talks about flying. Do you think we need to do that except in an emergency? Are you envisioning a future that's still capitalist, but essentially green technology? Big question.
Oh, blimey.
I think maybe Ruth, if that's okay, we'll do that one. Or unless you have one.
I often wake up in the middle of the night asking myself this question: is capitalism capable of changing? You see, and I think capitalism is, but I think we need radical action on ownership. Okay, I'm letting my ideology show here. Lots of people who think I'm mad. I think free markets work properly organized, properly directed, properly regulated. Free markets are an exceptional contribution to human welfare and personal happiness. I absolutely abhor modern large-scale monopoly capitalism, and that's probably shared by many of the XR members in this room. I come from a business background. I believe business can be a very important part of this, and I say in the book, for example, that without oil company participation, we ain't going to get that massive growth in the offshore oil industry, the offshore wind industry that I think we need. So that they can organize, large-scale companies can organize, they can project management, they can invest properly and so on and so forth. But we need to make sure that the investors in those companies have moved away from the rampant short-termism, their radical opposition to any form of building for future generations, to the point where it's possible for the likes of Shell to run their business to be truly compatible with a stable human civilization. Once again, it would be absolutely lovely to have a chance for us all to chat about this, because I think it's one of the most difficult questions and runs the risk of causing irreparable problems, breaches inside the climate change movement. And we need to discuss it more.
Yeah, there's a multitude of, I think, frankly, everyone's having a view, and everyone's having a go in their own way. We'll just see what comes to the surface, I suppose. Just to move on, Chris, that's okay. Matt says, do you think ground and air source heat pumps will also need to play a large role in heating, or do you think hydrogen should be the focus? Good question.
Yeah, sorry, it's absolutely central to because of the particular problems of the UK. Most parts of Europe, we can switch largely to ground source, or more probable, most places, air source heat pumps. we do seem to have big problems here. We've got problems that arise from very low quality of installation of these machines. They're not being put in properly, so bills are tending to rise. We've got problems that heat losses are so great that heat pumps often struggle to keep up. We also have a population that hasn't been properly educated as to how to use them, so they're run as though they exist, as though they're conventional boilers, but they're not. We also have a problem with the high humidity levels across most of the UK, which means that the heat pumps tend to freeze up at quite high temperatures, 3-4 degrees, and so on and so forth, well above freezing. So we have poor coefficients of performance. So yes, when we have insulated our housing stock much better, the role for heat pumps is going to be much larger than it is today. But we need to make radical changes to standards before we do that. Street by street, insulation, and then the installation of housing, of heat pumps, not the ad hoc and badly directed system that we have at the moment. In new housing, no question about it, electric heat pumps.
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, that's obviously a key kind of question right now, as everyone's looking at the heating of their stock. Certainly, I do a lot of work in commercial buildings, and that's a constant question. Only a couple more questions, everyone. Adriana, it's more of a statement, I don't know, but it says, would you know if there's any current development in terms of making it compulsory for employers to run climate awareness training in the same way that they're legally required to do GDPS or health and fire safety trainings? Educating public and our children at schools would change how we as consumers change from demand change.
Yeah, I've seen nothing on that, but more and more I get the sense that the people who run companies are wanting to educate their employees on why the future of their company depends upon developing zero carbon routes to operate. So I see more and more nervousness from large companies about their ability to attract and retain people as employees if they're not seen to be taking this seriously, educating people, running their business as though this was equally important to all the other objectives. But I've seen nothing mandated yet or talk of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. I have to say, it's something that we're seeing more and more of. I do a lot of work on net zero carbon with companies, and a lot of, actually, interestingly, the more carbon efficient the companies that got science-based targets, the companies that have got net zero targets, they're the ones who tend to be more resilient and seem to be actually making it better through the current crisis we're in, because they are more aware of the need to be resilient and have different routes to market. So it's definitely something that we do see some of. You're not going to be able to retain the best employees if you haven't got a proper plan for making this transition. So it's in the financial interests of companies to take this seriously. We've got one more question. I don't know if I want to answer. I don't think there's a good answer to this one. And Vivian, who's had to leave, says, for those of us that have relatives in Australia, what's the most eco-friendly suggested form of travel?
Oh dear, isn't it difficult? Isn't this difficult? Because we've built up our networks of connections of family around the world, and the idea that we're not going to be able to travel much by air is so painful. The best way to deal with it is to offset using one of the small number of genuine offset arrangements where you know that your money is actually going to result in the storage of CO2 permanently somewhere, probably in the earth. And there was an American company called Stripe, which which offered $1 million a few months ago to the best opportunities for permanent storage of CO2. And it came up with, it's just paid out the money. And if you look at that company, you'll see the kind of things that relative, very sophisticated company came up with as being the best ways of offsetting. It's not by planting another tree, it's by doing things such as rock weathering. But that, I think, is the only way that we're going to be able to continue to justify to ourselves for long distance aviation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just going to stop the sharing right now and bring everyone back into the room. I think we will leave it there. Thank you so much to everyone for staying with us through our technical issues. There's still 24 people in the room, which is really, really lovely to see. And just, yeah, a huge thank you to Chris for bearing through that and getting it work. So fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
And
thank you.
It's really good.
It's a real privilege. And if I may say, many of those questions required long and well thought through responses, and I didn't necessarily do a particularly good job, but those often seem to me to be absolutely crucial to our future as a society, and we need to debate them more. And I apologize once again for the poor quality of the satellite reception here, which broke us up for 15 minutes.
In answer to Eloise, just the comment that's come through, yes, the book is out now. It's on Kindle and it's on Amazon and all your favorite online bookshops. What we need to do now, in fact, it's right here. Look, there we go, Chris. Right there. It's a fascinating read, and it's not too long and dense, unlike some of these ones are. So it was £1.60 on Kindle last week. Yeah, thank you. So do go and buy a copy. And actually, I'd recommend the Switch as well if you're interested in the technologies. There's a whole section on batteries, actually, battery technology. I found fascinating. So, Chris, thank you very much again. Thank you much everyone for staying with us. And yeah, this is recorded, so we'll work out a way of getting on the website and following up. But yeah, once again, thank you very much.
Okay.
Such
all right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.